They beat him with 39 lashes across his bare back, 5 separate times. They pelted him with stones until his body lay motionless in the dirt outside the city walls. He spent a night and a day drifting in open sea after a shipwreck, clinging to broken planks while the Mediterranean swallowed everything he carried, and he endured all of this for the very faith he once tried to annihilate. This is the story of the Apostle Paul. Before you can grasp the magnitude of his transformation, you need to understand what he was before. The man the world would come to know as Paul was born Saul in the city of Tarsus, a Roman province in what is modern-day southeastern Turkey, around the year 4 or 5 of the Common Era. Tarsus was no backwater village. It was a thriving intellectual center, home to one of the 3 great university cities of the ancient world, rivaling Athens and Alexandria. The city sat along the banks of the Cydnus River, a key stop on Roman trade routes connecting the eastern provinces to the imperial core. Growing up here gave Saul something most Jewish boys in Palestine never received: fluency in Greek culture, familiarity with Stoic philosophy, and the legal protections of Roman citizenship, a status his family held and one that would later save his life more than once. But Saul's father was a devout Pharisee, a member of the tribe of Benjamin, and he ensured his son's education ran deeper than Hellenistic rhetoric. At roughly 13 years of age, Saul was sent to Jerusalem to study under Gamaliel, one of the most respected rabbinical teachers in Jewish history. Gamaliel was no extremist. The book of Acts, chapter 5, verses 33 through 39, records him counseling moderation when the Sanhedrin wanted to kill the early apostles. He advised patience, suggesting that if the Christian movement was of human origin, it would collapse on its own, but if it was from God, the council could not stop it without fighting God himself. Consider the irony. Saul sat under the teaching of a man who urged tolerance and emerged as the most aggressive persecutor the early church had ever seen. Philippians chapter 3 verses 5 and 6 records Saul's own summary of his credentials: circumcised on the 8th day, of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews. And as for zeal, a persecutor of the church; as for righteousness based on the law, faultless. That last word lands like a hammer: faultless. This was not a man troubled by doubt. This was a man operating with total certainty. And that certainty had consequences measured in human blood. The first time the historical record places Saul at the scene of violence is in Acts chapter 7, verse 58. Stephen, a deacon of the early church and the first Christian martyr, stood before the Sanhedrin and delivered a speech that systematically dismantled the council's authority. The crowd dragged him outside the city and crushed him with stones. The text says the witnesses laid their garments at the feet of a young man named Saul. He did not throw a single stone. He did not need to. He stood there holding the coats of the executioners, approving every blow. Acts chapter 8 verse 1 states it plainly. Saul approved of his execution. That word in the original Greek is synudikon, meaning full, conscious, enthusiastic agreement. Something broke open in Saul after Stephen's death, but it was not conscience, it was ambition. Acts chapter 8 verse 3 describes what followed. Saul began to destroy the church. The Greek verb used is elimeneto, a word typically reserved for the ravaging of an army or the mauling of a wild animal. He went house to house. He dragged out men and women. He threw them into prison. The scope of this campaign was not limited to a few arrests. Saul himself, in Galatians chapter 1, verse 13, admits he persecuted the church of God beyond measure and tried to destroy it. The word he uses for destroy is portheo, a military term meaning to lay waste, to sack, to level completely. This was not law enforcement. This was demolition. Picture the mechanics of his operation. Jerusalem in the late 30s of the first century held an estimated population of between 40,000 and 80,000 people during non-festival periods, swelling to several 100,000 during Passover. The early Christian community numbered perhaps 3,000 to 5,000 believers at this stage, scattered across private homes with no central meeting place, no public signage, no organizational infrastructure. Saul's task required intelligence gathering, informants, interrogations, networks of cooperation with local synagogue leaders. He built a system. He was effective, so effective that he received authorization from the high priest to extend his reach beyond Jerusalem entirely. Acts chapter 9 verses 1 and 2 records that Saul asked for and received letters to the synagogues in Damascus, a city roughly 240 kilometers north, a journey of roughly 6 days on foot, granting him authority to arrest any followers of the way and bring them bound to Jerusalem. Think about the logistics of that operation: prisoners, chains, guards, provisions for a week-long march through arid terrain. Saul was not conducting a casual investigation. He was running an extradition program. And then the road to Damascus erased everything he was. The account appears 3 times in the book of Acts, chapters 9, 22, and 26, each time told from a slightly different angle, a literary technique that underscores its centrality to the entire narrative. Around midday, as Saul and his entourage approached Damascus, a light brighter than the midday sun struck him to the ground. Every man in the group fell. A voice spoke in Aramaic. "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" Not, "Why are you persecuting my followers?" Me. The identification was total. Saul asked who was speaking. The answer dismantled his world in 4 words. "I am Jesus." Silence. For 3 days, Saul sat blind in a house on Straight Street in Damascus. He did not eat. He did not drink. The most aggressive anti-Christian operative in the ancient world sat in complete darkness. His theological framework shattered, his identity dissolved, his mission reversed. 3 days, 72 hours of absolute recalibration. A man who had built his entire life on being right was now forced to absorb the reality that he had been catastrophically, violently wrong. Now place yourself in the position of Ananias, the man God sent to restore Saul's sight. Acts chapter 9 verses 13 and 14 records his objection. "Lord, I have heard many reports about this man and all the harm he has done to your holy people in Jerusalem. And he has come here with authority from the chief priests to arrest all who call on your name." Ananias was being asked to walk into the house of the most dangerous man in his world and lay hands on him. The fear was not abstract. It was survival-level dread, and yet he went. The transformation was immediate and total and bewildering to everyone. Saul began preaching in the Damascus synagogues that Jesus was the Son of God. Acts chapter 9 verse 21 captures the collective shock. All those who heard him were astonished and asked, "Is this not the man who raised havoc in Jerusalem among those who call on this name?" The Greek word for astonished here is existanto, from which English derives the word ecstasy. It describes a displacement of the mind, a cognitive disruption so severe that normal processing fails. People could not reconcile what they were seeing with what they knew. And now Saul was hunted by both sides. The Jews in Damascus plotted to kill him. They watched the city gates day and night. His escape came in the most undignified way imaginable for a Roman citizen and trained Pharisee, lowered through an opening in the city wall in a large basket, like cargo, like contraband. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 33, records this detail, and Paul himself includes it in a list of hardships, suggesting the humiliation of it stayed with him. He traveled to Arabia, likely the Nabatean kingdom to the east, and spent roughly 3 years in relative obscurity. Galatians chapter 1 verses 17 and 18 provide the timeline. 3 years. The most intellectually gifted convert in early Christian history did not rush to the stage. He disappeared, he processed, he rebuilt his entire theological architecture from the foundation up. When he finally went to Jerusalem, he stayed only 15 days and met only with Peter and James, the brother of Jesus. The broader church wanted nothing to do with him. They were afraid. Barnabas changed that. Acts chapter 9 verse 27 records that Barnabas took Saul and brought him to the apostles, vouching for the authenticity of his conversion. Without Barnabas, Paul's ministry might have died in suspicion. One man's willingness to stake his reputation on an unlikely convert opened the door that fear had sealed shut. For approximately 8 to 10 years after his conversion, Saul largely disappears from the historical record. He returned to Tarsus. He likely worked as a tent maker, his trade, referenced in Acts chapter 18, verse 3, stitching cilicium, a coarse fabric made from goat hair native to the Cilician region. Imagine this: a man trained in the finest rabbinical academy in the world, fluent in 3 languages, holding Roman citizenship, spending years cutting and sewing rough cloth. The waiting was not glamorous. It was long and quiet and productive in ways that were invisible to everyone except him. Then Barnabas came to Tarsus and brought Saul to Antioch, the 3rd largest city in the Roman Empire, with a population estimated at between 300,000 and 500,000. Acts chapter 11 verse 26 records that it was in Antioch that followers of Jesus were first called Christians, and it was from Antioch that the first organized missionary journey launched, with Barnabas and Saul at its head. Now the scale of Paul's physical endurance begins to emerge, and it defies what the modern mind considers survivable. His first missionary journey, documented in Acts chapters 13 and 14, covered approximately 2,200 kilometers. He and Barnabas traveled by sea to Cyprus, crossed the entire island on foot, roughly 150 kilometers, then sailed to the southern coast of modern Turkey and trekked inland through the Taurus Mountains. The Taurus Range rises to peaks of over 3,500 meters. The passes Paul likely used sat at elevations of roughly 1,000 to 1,200 meters, cutting through terrain notorious for bandits and flash floods. The Roman geographer Strabo described these routes as among the most dangerous in the eastern provinces. Paul crossed them on foot, likely carrying supplies weighing 15 to 20 kilograms, wearing leather sandals with minimal sole protection. In Lystra, a city in the interior of modern Turkey, Paul healed a man crippled from birth. The crowd tried to worship him and Barnabas as Greek gods, Zeus and Hermes. Then, within days, Jews from Antioch and Iconium arrived and turned the same crowd against him. Acts chapter 14, verse 19, records that they stoned Paul and dragged him outside the city, leaving him for dead. Stoning in the ancient world was not symbolic. It involved rocks weighing between 2 and 5 kilograms hurled from close range at the head, chest, and torso. Victims typically died from cranial fractures, organ rupture, or internal hemorrhaging. Paul survived. The next day, he got up and walked back into the city. The next day, his second missionary journey extended the range dramatically, approximately 5,000 kilometers over roughly 2 to 3 years. He crossed through Asia Minor, received the vision of the Macedonian man calling for help, and crossed the Aegean Sea into Europe. He established churches in Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, Athens, and Corinth. In Philippi, he and Silas were stripped, beaten with rods, and thrown into the inner cell of the prison, with their feet fastened in stocks. Roman beatings with rods, the virgae, were administered by lictors using bundled birch rods. The strikes targeted the back, buttocks, and legs. Victims frequently suffered fractured vertebrae, torn muscle tissue, and permanent nerve damage. Paul endured this punishment 3 separate times over his career, according to 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 25. In Corinth, he stayed 18 months, one of his longest residences, working as a tent maker alongside Aquila and Priscilla, while establishing what would become one of the most troubled and most beloved churches in his network. The city had a population estimated at between 80,000 and 100,000 free citizens, plus a slave population of similar size. It was a port city with 2 harbors, a reputation for commercial ambition and moral excess, and a strategic position on the narrow isthmus connecting the Peloponnese to mainland Greece. Every product, philosophy, and vice of the Mediterranean world passed through Corinth. His third missionary journey added another estimated 4,000 to 5,000 kilometers. He spent roughly 3 years in Ephesus, a city of over 200,000 people and home to the Temple of Artemis, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The temple measured approximately 115 meters long by 55 meters wide, supported by 127 columns, each standing nearly 18 meters tall. Paul's preaching in Ephesus was so effective that the silversmiths who manufactured miniature shrines of Artemis saw their revenue decline sharply enough to trigger a riot. Acts chapter 19 records the scene. A mob dragged Paul's companions into the 25,000-seat theater, chanting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians," for 2 hours straight. The economic threat of the gospel was as concrete as the theological one. Across all 3 journeys combined, conservative estimates place Paul's total distance traveled at between 15,000 and 20,000 kilometers. That is roughly the distance from New York to Sydney, Australia. He covered most of it on foot, over unpaved Roman roads that averaged 3 to 4 meters in width, exposed to sun, rain, brigands, and terrain that shifted from coastal marshland to mountain passes within a single week's walk. His pace likely averaged 25 to 30 kilometers per day during active travel, meaning he spent the equivalent of 500 to 700 full days simply walking. And walking was not the hardest part. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 23 through 28, contains Paul's own inventory of suffering, and it reads like a trauma report. 5 times he received from the Jews 39 lashes. 3 times he was beaten with rods. Once he was pelted with stones. 3 times he was shipwrecked. He spent a night and a day in the open sea. He was constantly on the move, in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from his fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, in danger from false believers. He went without sleep, without food, without adequate clothing. He faced cold and exposure. Break those numbers down. 39 lashes, administered 5 times, equals 195 individual strikes to his back with a leather whip. The Jewish flagellation used a whip with 2 leather thongs, meaning each lash delivered 2 strikes, bringing the total number of impacts to 390. Roman medical writers noted that flagellation victims frequently went into shock after 20 to 30 strikes. Paul endured this nearly 400 times across 5 separate occasions and continued traveling and preaching after each one. The physical toll on his body was cumulative and permanent. Galatians chapter 6 verse 17 references the marks of Jesus that he carried on his body. The Greek word is stigmata, referring to visible scars or brands. His back bore the ridged scarring of repeated flagellation. His head and torso likely carried the dented tissue of stone impacts. His wrists and ankles bore the abrasion marks of chains and stocks. By the time he wrote his later letters, Paul was almost certainly dealing with chronic pain, limited mobility, and the systemic consequences of repeated physical trauma, conditions that modern sports medicine would classify as cumulative traumatic injury. And yet the letters kept coming. 13 epistles bear his name. Romans alone runs to roughly 7,100 words in the original Greek, a sophisticated theological treatise that has shaped Western philosophy, legal theory, and ethics for 2 millennia. He dictated most of his letters, a common practice in the ancient world, but the intellectual architecture was entirely his own. He wrote to churches in crisis, churches in conflict, churches facing persecution, and churches drifting into theological error. He wrote from prison cells, from borrowed rooms, from the homes of fellow believers. He wrote while hungry, while chained, while awaiting trial. 1 Thessalonians, likely his earliest surviving letter, was written around the year 50 or 51, roughly 20 years after his conversion, and demonstrates a mind operating at full capacity despite a body under relentless assault. The letter to the Philippians offers a window into his psychological state during imprisonment. Chapter 1, verses 21 through 24, contains what may be the most transparent moment of internal tension in all of ancient literature. He writes that to live is Christ and to die is gain. He is torn between the two, desiring to depart and be with Christ, which he considers far better, yet recognizing that remaining in the body is more necessary for the sake of the churches. This is not theological abstraction. This is a man in chains, calculating the relative value of his own continued existence and deciding that the needs of others outweigh his desire for relief. Examine the scope of what he built. By the time of his final imprisonment, Paul had established or significantly influenced Christian communities across an arc stretching from Jerusalem to Rome, a span of roughly 3,700 kilometers. These communities were not abstract theological experiments. They were functioning social organisms with leadership structures, financial systems, conflict resolution protocols, and liturgical practices. The letters to Timothy and Titus contain detailed organizational instructions, qualifications for elders and deacons, guidelines for caring for widows, protocols for handling accusations against leaders. Paul was not merely a preacher. He was an institutional architect, designing systems meant to outlast his own death. His relationship with the Jerusalem church remained complicated throughout his ministry. The Council of Jerusalem, described in Acts chapter 15, addressed the fundamental question of whether Gentile converts needed to follow Jewish law. The debate was fierce. Paul and Barnabas argued for Gentile freedom from circumcision and dietary laws. James, the brother of Jesus, delivered the final ruling, a compromise that required Gentile believers to abstain from food polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from the meat of strangled animals, and from blood, but imposed no other requirements. The decision preserved unity, but the tension never fully dissolved. Galatians chapter 2, verses 11 through 14, records Paul publicly confronting Peter in Antioch for withdrawing from table fellowship with Gentile believers when representatives from James arrived. Paul called it hypocrisy to Peter's face. The most prominent leader of the early church was corrected by a former persecutor in front of the entire community. That confrontation reveals something critical about Paul's operating logic. He did not defer to human authority when he believed theological truth was at stake. He respected Peter, he acknowledged James, but he would not yield on principle even when the cost was social rupture. This made him effective and lonely. The final journey to Jerusalem, described in Acts chapters 20 and 21, carries the weight of a man walking knowingly into captivity. In Miletus, he summoned the elders of the Ephesian church for a farewell address. Acts chapter 20, verse 22, records his words, "Compelled by the Spirit, I am going to Jerusalem, not knowing what will happen to me there, except that in every city the Holy Spirit warns me that prison and hardships are facing me." The prophet Agabus, took Paul's belt, bound his own hands and feet, and declared that the owner of this belt would be bound in Jerusalem. Paul's companions begged him not to go. He refused to be dissuaded. Acts chapter 21, verse 13, preserves his response. I am ready not only to be bound, but also to die in Jerusalem for the name of the Lord Jesus. He arrived. He was recognized in the temple. A mob seized him and beat him. Roman soldiers intervened, not to rescue him, but to prevent a riot. The commander ordered Paul to be flogged for information, a process using the flagellum, a Roman whip embedded with bone fragments and lead balls designed to strip flesh from muscle. Paul stopped the procedure with 5 words. Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who has not been found guilty? Acts chapter 22, verse 29. The soldiers withdrew immediately. Roman citizenship was Paul's shield, and he deployed it with the precision of a trained legal advocate. What followed was roughly 4 to 5 years of imprisonment. 2 years in Caesarea Maritima under the governors Felix and Festus, during which Paul made his defense before King Agrippa II. Then the voyage to Rome, a journey that included a catastrophic shipwreck off the coast of Malta. The ship carried 276 people. Acts chapter 27 provides one of the most detailed accounts of ancient maritime disaster in all of classical literature. The 14-day storm, the jettisoning of cargo, the breaking apart of the vessel on a sandbar, the swimming and floating to shore on planks and pieces of the ship. Every person survived. In Rome, Paul spent approximately 2 years under house arrest, chained to a rotating guard of Roman soldiers. Acts chapter 28, verse 30, records that he lived in his own rented quarters and welcomed all who came to him. Even in chains he taught. Even under guard he wrote. Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Philemon. 4 letters that have been read, studied, translated, and preached in virtually every language on earth for nearly 2,000 years, all written from a room he could not leave by a man chained to his jailer. The circumstances of his death are not recorded in the book of Acts. Early church tradition, supported by Clement of Rome writing around the year 96, indicates that Paul was executed by beheading during the reign of Emperor Nero, likely around the year 64 to 67. As a Roman citizen, he was spared crucifixion, the execution method reserved for non-citizens and slaves. Beheading by sword was considered the more dignified death under Roman law. Tradition places the execution site along the Ostian Way, roughly 5 kilometers south of Rome's city center, the Basilica of St. Paul. Outside the walls stands there today a structure measuring 131 meters in length with a nave supported by 80 granite columns built over what is believed to be his burial site. He was approximately 60 to 65 years old. He had spent roughly 30 years in active ministry. He had crossed the Mediterranean world multiple times on foot and by sea. He had been arrested, beaten, stoned, shipwrecked, imprisoned, abandoned by friends, opposed by rivals, and misunderstood by allies. He had planted churches across 4 modern nations. He had written documents that would be translated into over 700 languages. He had articulated theological concepts, justification by faith, the body of Christ as metaphor for community, the relationship between law and grace, that would shape the intellectual trajectory of Western civilization more profoundly than any philosopher of his era. And he never saw it. He never knew that his letter to a small, troubled church in Rome would become the foundation of Protestant theology 15 centuries later. He never imagined that his personal note to Philemon about a runaway slave would fuel abolitionist arguments in the 18th and 19th centuries. He never calculated that the communities he stitched together from Corinth to Colossae would outlast the Roman Empire that chained him. He wrote to solve immediate problems: factions in Corinth, heresy in Galatia, discouragement in Thessalonica. Each letter was a response to a crisis, not a chapter in a book he was planning. The New Testament as a unified collection did not exist in his lifetime. His writings circulated on individual scrolls, hand-copied by scribes, carried by foot messengers across hundreds of kilometers of Roman road. The man who held the coats at Stephen's stoning became the man who would lose his own life by the blade. The man who dragged believers from their homes became the man who built homes for believers across an empire. The persecutor became the prisoner, and the prisoner became the voice that still speaks across 2,000 years of human history. Every scar on his body was a word in a language that outlived the empire that inflicted them.